Thomas Brady lived on the outskirts of Payson, Arizona, in a house that slouched against time and weather like an exhausted man. It wasn't much, just 4 sun-bleached walls and a roof patched with whatever material he could scavenge: old tarp, mismatched shingles, even scrap sheet metal from a dismantled chicken coop. The front steps creaked like they feared collapse, and a coyote had once nested beneath the porch. But inside, it was warm where it mattered, clean where it could be, and most of all, it was home to his son, Miles. He was 36 years old and already lived as though his best years were a memory. Before, he had worn the uniform of an Air Force mechanic, stationed in hangars that smelled of oil and jet fuel. He had once moved with the sure steps of someone who had direction, a man whose hands had kept aircraft in the sky. The military had been structure, family, and purpose. But none of it had prepared him for what life would feel like once the rhythm of service gave way to the silence of grief. His wife, Dana, had been the last thread tying him to that life. She had died on a rainy evening 3 years ago, a wreck on a winding road that had no guardrails and even fewer streetlights. The call came while he was still on duty, hands inside a fuel manifold, unaware that everything solid in his life was slipping away. After the funeral, he folded his uniform into a box and walked away from the only world he had known. The medals were tucked inside that same box, now buried in the bottom of a closet. He never opened it anymore. Without her, the world lost its symmetry. He became a single father with a resume that didn't translate and a grief that never paused. Civilian employers didn't know what to do with military credentials. Thomas found no comfort in interviews, where the language of KP duty and base logistics meant nothing. So he fell back on what he knew: fixing things. Broken generators, busted air conditioning units, cracked solar inverters. He picked up delivery gigs on the side, weaving through long stretches of Arizona highway, packages in the back and worries in the front seat. Each job was a stopgap. The phone rarely rang twice. He took what he could get, even if it paid little. In summer, the heat poured through the windshield like molten air. The steering wheel burned his palms, and the cracked vinyl seats left sweat-soaked imprints on his clothes. Still, he drove, because the work gave him just enough to buy groceries, pay for Miles's school books, and keep the lights on, when they stayed on. Their house was old in a way that demanded attention. The pipes groaned like they remembered better days. The walls wore the handprints of past tenants, and the insulation might as well have been paper. In winter, cold crept in from every corner. Thomas stuffed towels beneath the doors and covered windows with plastic sheeting. In the monsoon season, he kept a bucket beneath the skylight, emptying it hourly when the storms came heavy. But he never complained. Especially not in front of Miles. He protected his son from the weight of things. He turned scarcity into adventure. Breakfast for dinner when the fridge was bare became a treat. Power outages were flashlight camping trips. When Miles asked if they were poor, Thomas smiled and said they were rich in time together. At night, he read to him from library books and old manuals. He taught him how a spark plug worked, how to change a tire, and how kindness was something you gave without reason. Homeschooling was not a choice born from ideology, but from necessity. The public schools were too far, and his schedule too unpredictable. So Thomas taught reading and arithmetic between jobs, weaving lessons into daily chores. They calculated grocery budgets as math problems. They read out loud during breakfast. Science became a car battery and a coil of wire. Life was the classroom, and every day, Thomas tried to give his son what little structure he himself had lost. What Thomas feared most was not hardship. He had faced that before. What haunted him was the idea that Miles might grow up thinking struggle was his fault. He wanted to shield him from that, the shame, the silence that follows rejection, the slow erosion of self-worth. Thomas had learned how to wear dignity like armor, even when everything beneath it was crumbling. Some mornings, he stood at the kitchen sink holding a chipped mug of instant coffee, watching Miles draw spaceships at the kitchen table. The desert light filtered in sideways, touching the boy's hair, casting everything in gold. In those moments, he felt both defeated and saved. Nothing about their life was easy, but it was held together by something stronger than comfort: love. Quiet, constant, unquestioning love. He missed the noise of the hangars, the camaraderie of the flight line, the way a team moved as one to push metal birds into the sky. In those days, he had mattered in ways no one questioned. But now, most days passed without notice. He was just another face at the parts store, another number on a work order, another father juggling bills while trying to stretch a gallon of milk and make sure the shoes still fit by next season. Evenings were the loneliest. After Miles was asleep, Thomas would sit at the kitchen table and go through receipts. He circled dates on a wall calendar, marking the gaps between jobs. Sometimes he scribbled ideas for side businesses on the back of envelopes, mobile repairs, maybe solar installations, then crossed them out, knowing he lacked the capital or credentials to start. Still, he kept trying. Not because he believed success would come, but because giving up meant surrendering the world he was trying to build for his son. And Thomas Brady had never been one to surrender. The road back from a delivery job wound through a forgotten stretch of Arizona desert, miles of nothing but dry shrubs, bleached bones, and power lines that stretched on like they were searching for somewhere to matter. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long shadows and lighting the dust in gold. Thomas Brady had just dropped off 3 solar inverters outside Globe and was heading home, exhausted but satisfied to have earned enough for a week's groceries and a tank of gas. The truck's air conditioning had stopped working a week prior, so he rode with the windows down, letting the hot wind slap his face while the engine hummed with familiar fatigue. Miles would be waiting. He had promised pancakes for dinner, their own little ritual after long days. A small treat. One they both looked forward to. He watched the sun dip closer to the mountains and estimated he had just enough daylight to make it home before the desert chill crept in. That's when he saw it, an old blue sedan stalled on the shoulder, hood up, steam curling into the evening air like a tired ghost. A man stood beside it, tall and still, wearing a wide-brimmed cowboy hat and leaning into the engine bay like someone trying to remember how engines used to make sense. From the way he held himself, stiff, like pain had become a familiar companion, Thomas guessed the man was in his 70s, maybe older. He slowed without thinking. Not because he had time, but because something inside him refused to pass a stranded motorist without stopping. A reflex burned into him during years of military service. You always checked. You never drove past someone in need, no matter the hour, the weather, or the cost to your schedule. He parked behind the sedan and stepped out, gravel crunching beneath his boots. His hands were still dirty from the last job, grease under the nails, a faint scar across his left knuckle where a wrench had slipped that morning. As he approached the car, the man glanced over but said nothing. There was no panic in his face, no desperation. Just a quiet readiness, as if he already expected that no one would stop. Thomas leaned in, eyes scanning the engine. Years of experience narrowed the issue down within seconds, a blown fuse and heavy corrosion on the battery terminals. Easy fix. He returned to his truck, grabbed his kit, and got to work. His hands moved fast, deliberate, like they remembered how to solve problems even when the rest of his life felt unsolvable. The old man stood by silently, not offering help or explanation. He watched with a stillness that felt almost ceremonial. As Thomas replaced the fuse and cleaned the connections with a wire brush, he noticed the trunk was slightly ajar. Inside were thick binders, folders secured with military-grade straps, and a black case that looked like it belonged in a command post, not a civilian trunk. He didn't pry. That wasn't his business. His job was to get the car moving. Within 15 minutes, the engine coughed back to life, shaky at first, then smooth. He closed the hood, wiped his hands on an old rag, and nodded once to the man. There was no handshake, no request for payment, no story exchanged. The man simply looked at Thomas with something more than gratitude, something like recognition, and then returned to the driver's seat without a word. Thomas got back in his truck and pulled onto the road, the sunset now a strip of fire in his rearview mirror. He didn't think much of it. He had helped someone. That was enough. As the miles passed, the moment began to fade, another anonymous kindness in a life that often felt too empty to notice its own weight. By the time he pulled into his driveway, the evening had settled in, and the house stood like it always did, worn, quiet, waiting. Miles greeted him at the door with excitement, unaware of the stranger on the roadside or the small act that had just occurred. Inside, the kitchen smelled of syrup and warm batter. Thomas flipped pancakes with one hand and ruffled his son's hair with the other. The grease under his nails remained, a stubborn reminder of the day's labor. But it didn't matter. In this house, with its flickering porch light and chipped tile, he was building something steady, one plate, one lesson, one act at a time. Later that night, when Miles was asleep and the wind whistled through the broken seals in the windows, Thomas sat alone with a glass of water, staring at the small notepad where he tracked expenses and job leads. He didn't write anything. Just listened to the silence. He had no idea that his actions on that roadside, unrecorded, unrewarded, had been observed. He didn't know the man he had helped wasn't just a retiree with engine trouble. He didn't know that inside the folders in the trunk were reports bound for the Senate. He didn't know that the brief connection, one mechanic helping a stranger without question, had already begun to ripple outward into a world he'd stopped believing could change. He had simply helped, without needing to know why. And then gone home. Because that's what decent men do. The morning after the roadside repair began like every other, quietly, unremarkably. Thomas rose before the sun, as he always did. The small alarm clock buzzed just loud enough to wake him but not disturb Miles, who slept in the next room under a pile of mismatched blankets. In the stillness, Thomas moved through the kitchen, heating water on the stove, mixing powdered coffee with the last of the sugar, and packing a basic lunch of peanut butter sandwiches and apple slices. Routine was his scaffold. Each day built carefully on the one before, not for glory or gain, but for the steady rhythm that kept his son safe and himself from unraveling. He ironed Miles's shirt, brushing off a mustard stain from yesterday's lunch, and made sure the boy's shoelaces were double-knotted. They walked a mile to the local elementary school as they always did, hand in hand for part of the way, then apart as Miles skipped ahead, a backpack bouncing on his narrow shoulders. But something was different when they arrived. The gates were open. Children laughed on the playground. Parents chatted near their cars. But the staff stood with their backs a little too straight, their eyes flicking toward Thomas without meeting them. A school aide stepped forward, someone Thomas had met before but didn't know by name. Her voice was soft, her tone apologetic. She used words like temporary issue and unforeseen administrative hold, the kind of vague phrases that sounded official but meant nothing at all. There was no accusation, no raised voice, only a gentle refusal. Miles looked up at his father, confused. Thomas crouched and whispered something meant to reassure, even though he didn't fully understand what was happening himself. They turned around. Walked home. The gate clicking shut behind them felt louder than it should have. On the way back, Thomas noticed a black van parked 3 houses down from theirs. Windows tinted dark. Engine off. Motionless. By the time they reached their front porch, there were 3. 3 identical black vans. Unmarked. Tires coated in road dust. Men in dark suits stood beside them, one leaning against the front bumper, the others near the sidewalk. They weren't armed, at least not visibly, and their stance wasn't threatening. But they watched. Calmly. As if they had been waiting. Thomas's instincts stirred. The kind that didn't come from fear, but from years of training, subtle posture shifts, exits subconsciously mapped, the weight of silence meaning more than spoken words. He said nothing. He ushered Miles inside. Locked the door without being obvious. Pulled the blinds, then made breakfast like it was just another day. Pancakes again. Familiar comfort. Miles didn't ask about school. Children often understood more than they let on. Thomas's mind raced as he cleaned the dishes. He checked the mailbox. Nothing. No letter, no warning. The vans didn't move. The men didn't approach. They simply stood, like sentinels guarding something unseen. The desert heat rose steadily, but the air around the house felt colder somehow, a pause in time. He wondered if it was a mistake. If the man on the roadside had been involved in something illegal, and now Thomas was under suspicion. But the men outside didn't look like law enforcement. They didn't move with urgency. They moved like men who already knew the answer. It wasn't until late afternoon that he began to understand. A brief knock. Then a letter slid under the door. Thick envelope. Heavy cardstock. No postage. Just his name, Thomas Brady, written in sharp ink across the front. Inside, a sealed document and a single business card. There were no threats. No demands. Just a note of acknowledgement and an invitation. The letter explained who the man on the roadside truly was. John Avery. A former federal director of National Infrastructure Protection, now working quietly under contract with a Senate subcommittee to evaluate the state of veteran reintegration. The car breakdown had been staged. The entire incident a carefully crafted scenario designed to identify acts of selfless service, those rare moments when someone helps not for attention, not for payment, but because it's the right thing to do. Thomas had been chosen. Not randomly. Not by luck. But because of what he did when no one was supposed to be watching. Avery's documents included a full explanation. His trunk had held materials bound for classified presentation, technical analyses, personnel reports, unannounced initiatives. All under tight surveillance. But Avery believed that true insight into veteran life couldn't come from interviews or statistics. It had to be witnessed. And that's what Thomas had unknowingly done, passed a test, a hidden filter through which integrity revealed itself. The envelope also contained a warning. Until further decisions were made, Thomas and his family were to remain at home. Not under arrest. Not under suspicion. Under protection. A courtesy extended because Avery had not only seen Thomas's actions, but had chosen to intervene on his behalf. The vans were not surveillance. They were guardianship. Thomas sat for a long time that evening, reading the letter again and again, trying to absorb what it meant. It didn't feel real. But in the hallway mirror, he saw himself, tired, still stained with grease, holding a letter with a government seal and a name he remembered vaguely from national briefings years ago. His hands trembled just slightly. Not from fear. From the strange weight of being seen after so long in invisibility. Outside, the sun dipped again behind the jagged hills. The desert glowed briefly before darkness returned. 3 vans remained. So did the silence. But now, it was a silence that meant something else. The photograph hung quietly in the entry hall of the Mesa Veterans Training Center. Framed in matte black, it captured 3 distinct images merged into one: an old truck on a dusty Arizona road, a boy holding his father's hand beside a crumbling house, and 3 black vans parked against the dying sun. Visitors rarely noticed it at first. It didn't demand attention. But those who paused long enough to look closer always found themselves still, their thoughts slowing, as if the silence in the photo extended outward to hush the room. Below the frame, a plaque carried only a few words: 1 action. 1 mechanic. 1 road, a new beginning. Thomas Brady never sought attention. In Mesa, he became known as a leader without title. His hands were always busy, fitting copper wiring into water-damaged conduits, restoring energy grids after flash floods, teaching other veterans how to read new circuit schematics with worn hands and patient resolve. The Veterans Infrastructure Corps had grown quietly, as it was meant to. What started as a pilot program became a new model for federal service, veterans rebuilding the systems of a country they had already protected. In that work, Thomas found something he had not felt since the hangars: belonging without pretense. He never gave interviews, despite requests. A journalist once waited outside the training center for 2 days hoping for a statement, but Thomas never appeared. He hadn't refused out of pride. He simply didn't believe that helping was headline-worthy. He would say, when pressed, that all he had done was fix a car. He didn't see legacy in that moment. He only saw a man who needed help and a fuse that needed changing. But those who worked with him knew otherwise. They noticed how he remembered everyone's name, how he kept a handwritten log of which trainees needed extra time or support, how he fixed not just broken wiring, but broken confidence. In team meetings, he rarely spoke first, but his words often settled debates simply by their weight. When funding cuts were proposed, it was his testimony, given in a quiet, windowless room to a handful of lawmakers, that preserved the program. He never mentioned his own hardships. Not the nights of cold cereal, the jobs lost, the denial of school entry for his son. He spoke only of potential, of how service, when redirected inward, could repair more than machines. It could repair people, towns, trust. At home, life was simple but no longer fragile. Miles thrived in school, now surrounded by teachers who knew his name, counselors who understood his past, and classmates who welcomed him with the ease only children know. He began drawing again, not spaceships anymore, but buildings and bridges. One day he told his father he wanted to build something that wouldn't fall apart when the wind blew too hard. On weekends, they drove to Payson. Not to mourn, to remember. They kept the old house, though it stood empty now. The porch had been reinforced, the roof patched. Thomas refused to sell it. Sometimes, they brought groceries to old neighbors. Sometimes, he fixed a water heater or helped install a ramp for an elderly couple who used to glance away when he walked by. The town remembered, too, not with loud apologies, but with quieter changes, a nod of respect, a slower wave, a door held open. Kindness, like rust, spreads quietly. Years passed, and his name never appeared in headlines. But the programs grew. Other towns followed Mesa's example. Other veterans found new purpose in forgotten neighborhoods, learning from those like Thomas who had made dignity their blueprint. One winter, the training center dedicated a wing to post-service family education. At the ceremony, a new plaque was installed beside the photo. It bore a quote, not from a speech, but from a conversation once overheard by a staffer and recorded without Thomas's knowledge. It read, "Kindness isn't about who deserves it. It's about who we choose to be." That was how Thomas Brady's story ended, not in acclaim or accolades, but in the quiet ripple of lives rebuilt, one repair at a time. The photo remained. People still stopped before it, especially new recruits. They would stare for a while at the image of the man, the boy, and the vans. And they would leave with something changed, even if they couldn't name it. That was the nature of legacy, not thunderous, not towering, but quietly undeniable. And that was enough.